Section 2, Part 2 of the Apaches. Chapter 4, Tribal Amusements, Manners, and Customs. To celebrate each noted event, a feast and dance would be given. Perhaps only our own people, perhaps neighboring tribes would be invited. These festivities usually lasted for about 4 days. By day we feasted. By night, under the direction of some chief, we danced. The music for our dance was singing led by the warriors, and accompanied by beating the Asa Deklugie, buckskin, on a hoop. No words were sung, only the tones. When the feasting and dancing were over, we would have horse races, foot races, wrestling, jumping, and all sorts of games, gambling. Among these games, the most noted was the tribal game of Ka, foot. It is played as follows. 4 moccasins are placed about 4 feet apart in holes in the ground, dug in a row on one side of the camp, and on the opposite side a similar parallel row. At night a campfire is started between these 2 rows of moccasins, and the players are arranged on sides, 1 or any number on each side. The score is kept by a bundle of sticks, from which each side takes a stick for every point won. First one side takes the bone, a symbol of the white rock used by the eagle in slaying the nameless monster, puts up blankets between the 4 moccasins and the fire so that the opposing team cannot observe their movements, and then begin to sing the legends of creation. The side having the bone represents the feathered tribe. The opposite side represents the beasts. The players representing the birds do all the singing, and while singing hide the bone in one of the moccasins. Then the blankets are thrown down. They continue to sing, but as soon as the blankets are thrown down, the chosen player from the opposing team, armed with a war club, comes to their side of the campfire, and with his club strikes the moccasin in which he thinks the bone is hidden. If he strikes the right moccasin, his side gets the bone, and in turn represents the birds, while the opposing team must keep quiet and guess in turn. There are only 4 plays, 3 that lose and 1 that wins. When all the sticks are gone from the bundle, the side having the largest number of sticks is counted winner. This game is seldom played except as a gambling game, but for that purpose it is the most popular game known to the tribe. Usually the game lasts 4 or 5 hours. It is never played in daytime. After the games are all finished, the visitors say, "We are satisfied," and the camp is broken up. I was always glad when the dances and feasts were announced. So were all the other young people. Our life also had a religious side. We had no churches, no religious organizations, no Sabbath day, no holidays, and yet we worshipped. Sometimes the whole tribe would assemble to sing and pray. Sometimes a smaller number, perhaps only 2 or 3. The songs had a few words, but were not formal. The singer would occasionally put in such words as he wished, instead of the usual tone sound. Sometimes we prayed in silence. Sometimes each one prayed aloud. Sometimes an aged person prayed for all of us. At other times one would rise and speak to us of our duties to each other and to Usen. Our services were short. When disease or pestilence abounded, we were assembled and questioned by our leaders to ascertain what evil we had done and how Usen could be satisfied. Sometimes sacrifice was deemed necessary. Sometimes the offending one was punished. If an Apache had allowed his aged parents to suffer for food or shelter, if he had neglected or abused the sick, if he had profaned our religion, or had been unfaithful, he might be banished from the tribe. The Apaches had no prisons as white men have. Instead of sending their criminals into prison, they sent them out of their tribe. These faithless, cruel, lazy, or cowardly members of the tribe were excluded in such a manner that they could not join any other tribe. Neither could they have any protection from our unwritten tribal laws. Frequently these outlaw Indians banded together and committed depredations which were charged against the regular tribe. However, the life of an outlaw Indian was a hard lot, and their bands never became very large. Besides, these bands frequently provoked the wrath of the tribe and secured their own destruction. When I was about 8 or 10 years old, I began to follow the chase, and to me this was never work. Out on the prairies which ran up to our mountain homes wandered herds of deer, antelope, elk, and buffalo, to be slaughtered when we needed them. Usually we hunted buffalo on horseback, killing them with arrows and spears. Their skins were used to make teepees and bedding, their flesh to eat. It required more skill to hunt the deer than any other animal. We never tried to approach a deer except against the wind. Frequently we would spend hours in stealing upon some grazing deer. If they were in the open, we would crawl long distances on the ground, keeping a weed or brush before us so that our approach would not be noticed. Often we would kill several out of one herd before the others would run away. Their flesh was dried and packed in vessels and would keep in this condition for many months. The hide of the deer was soaked in water and ashes and the hair removed, and then the process of tanning continued until the buckskin was soft and pliable. Perhaps no other animal was more valuable to us than the deer. In the forests and along the streams were many wild turkeys. These we would drive to the plains, then slowly ride up toward them until they were almost tired out. When they began to drop and hide, we would ride in upon them, and by swinging from the side of our horses, catch them. If one started to fly, we would ride swiftly under him and kill him with a short stick or hunting club. In this way we could usually get as many wild turkeys as we could carry home on a horse. There were many rabbits in our range, and we also hunted them on horseback. Our horses were trained to follow the rabbit at full speed, and as they approached them, we would swing from one side of the horse and strike the rabbit with our hunting club. If he was too far away, we would throw the stick and kill him. This was great sport when we were boys, but as warriors we seldom hunted small game. There were many fish in the streams, but as we did not eat them, we did not try to catch or kill them. Small boys sometimes threw stones at them, or shot at them for practice with their bows and arrows. Usen did not intend snakes, frogs, or fishes to be eaten. I have never eaten of them. There were many eagles in the mountains. These we hunted for their feathers. It required great skill to steal upon an eagle, for besides having sharp eyes, he is wise and never stops at any place where he does not have a good view of the surrounding country. I have killed many bears with a spear, but was never injured in a fight with one. I have killed several mountain lions with arrows and one with a spear. Both bears and mountain lions are good for food and valuable for their skin. When we killed them, we carried them home on our horses. We often made quivers for our arrows from the skin of the mountain lion. These were very pretty and very durable. During my minority we had never seen a missionary or a priest. We had never seen a white man. Thus quietly lived the Bedonkohe Apaches. Chapter 5. The Family. My grandfather Mako had been our chief. I never saw him, but my father often told me of the great size, strength, and sagacity of this old warrior. Their principal wars had been with the Mexicans. They had some wars with other tribes of Indians also, but were seldom at peace for any great length of time with the Mexican towns. Mako died when my father was but a young warrior, and Mangus Colorado became chief of the Bedonkohe Apaches. When I was but a small boy, my father died, after having been sick for some time. When he passed away, carefully the watchers closed his eyes. Then they arrayed him in his best clothes, painted his face afresh, wrapped a rich blanket around him, saddled his favorite horse, bore his arms in front of him, and led his horse behind, repeating in wailing tones his deeds of valor as they carried his body to a cave in the mountain. Then they slew his horses, and we gave away all of his other property, as was customary in our tribe, after which his body was deposited in the cave, his arms beside him. His grave is hidden by piles of stone. Wrapped in splendor he lies in seclusion, and the winds in the pines sing a low requiem over the dead warrior. After my father's death I assumed the care of my mother. She never married again, although according to the customs of our tribe she might have done so immediately after his death. Usually, however, the widow who has children remains single after her husband's death for 2 or 3 years, but the widow without children marries again immediately. After a warrior's death his widow returns to her people, and may be given away or sold by her father or brothers. My mother chose to live with me, and she never desired to marry again. We lived near our old home, and I supported her. In 1846, being 17 years of age, I was admitted to the council of the warriors. Then I was very happy, for I could go wherever I wanted and do whatever I liked. I had not been under the control of any individual, but the customs of our tribe prohibited me from sharing the glories of the warpath until the council admitted me. When opportunity offered after this, I could go on the warpath with my tribe. This would be glorious. I hoped soon to serve my people in battle. I had long desired to fight with our warriors. Perhaps the greatest joy to me was that now I could marry the fair Alope, daughter of Naposo. She was a slender, delicate girl, but we had been lovers for a long time. So, as soon as the council granted me these privileges, I went to see her father concerning our marriage. Perhaps our love was of no interest to him. Perhaps he wanted to keep Alope with him, for she was a dutiful daughter. At any rate, he asked many ponies for her. I made no reply, but in a few days appeared before his wigwam with the herd of ponies, and took with me Alope. This was all the marriage ceremony necessary in our tribe. Not far from my mother's teepee I had made for us a new home. The teepee was made of buffalo hides, and in it were many bear robes, lion hides, and other trophies of the chase, as well as my spears, bows, and arrows. Alope had made many little decorations of beads and drawn work on buckskin, which she placed in our teepee. She also drew many pictures on the walls of our home. She was a good wife, but she was never strong. We followed the traditions of our fathers and were happy. 3 children came to us, children that played, loitered, and worked as I had done. Chapter 6. Casquilla. In the summer of 1858, being at peace with the Mexican towns as well as with all the neighboring Indian tribes, we went south into Old Mexico to trade. Our whole tribe, Bedonkohe Apaches, went through Sonora towards Casa Grande, our destination. But just before reaching that place we stopped at another Mexican town called by the Indians Casquilla. Here we stayed for several days, camping just outside the city. Every day we would go into town to trade, leaving our camp under the protection of a small guard so that our arms, supplies, and women and children would not be disturbed during our absence. Late one afternoon, when returning from town, we were met by a few women and children who told us that the Mexican troops from some other town had attacked our camp, killed all the warriors of the guard, captured all our ponies, secured our arms, destroyed our supplies, and killed many of our women and children. Quickly we separated, concealing ourselves as best we could until nightfall, when we assembled at our appointed place of rendezvous, a thicket by the river. Silently we stole in, one by one. Sentinels were placed, and when all were counted, I found that my aged mother, my young wife, and my 3 small children were among the slain. There were no lights in camp, so without being noticed I silently turned away and stood by the river. How long I stood there I do not know, but when I saw the warriors arranging for a council, I took my place. That night I did not give my vote for or against any measure, but it was decided that, as there were only 80 warriors left, and as we were without arms or supplies, and were, furthermore, surrounded by the Mexicans far inside their own territory, we could not hope to fight successfully. So our chief, Mangus Colorado, gave the order to start at once in perfect silence for our homes in Arizona, leaving the dead upon the field. I stood until all had passed, hardly knowing what I would do. I had no weapon, nor did I hardly wish to fight. Neither did I contemplate recovering the bodies of my loved ones, for that was forbidden. I did not pray, nor did I resolve to do anything in particular, for I had no purpose left. I finally followed the tribe silently, keeping just within hearing distance of the soft noise of the feet of the retreating Apaches. The next morning some of the Indians killed a small amount of game, and we halted long enough for the tribe to cook and eat, when the march was resumed. I had killed no game and did not eat. During the first march, as well as while we were camped at this place, I spoke to no one, and no one spoke to me. There was nothing to say. For 2 days and 3 nights we were on forced marches, stopping only for meals. Then we made a camp near the Mexican border, where we rested 2 days. Here I took some food, and talked with the other Indians who had lost in the massacre, but none had lost as I had, for I had lost all. Within a few days we arrived at our own settlement. There were the decorations that Alope had made, and there were the playthings of our little ones. I burned them all, even our teepee. I also burned my mother's teepee and destroyed all her property. I was never again contented in our quiet home. True, I could visit my father's grave, but I had vowed vengeance upon the Mexican troopers who had wronged me, and whenever I came near his grave, or saw anything to remind me of my former happy days, my heart would ache for revenge upon Mexico. As soon as we had again collected some arms and supplies, Mangus Colorado, our chief, called a council, and found that all our warriors were willing to take the warpath against Mexico. I was appointed to solicit the aid of other tribes in this war. When I went to the Jaconan Chiricahua Apaches, Cochise, their chief, called a council at early dawn. Silently the warriors assembled at an open place in a mountain dell, and took their seats on the ground, arranged in rows according to their ranks. Silently they sat smoking. At a signal from the chief, I arose and presented my cause as follows. Kinsmen, you have heard what the Mexicans have recently done without cause. You are my relatives, uncles, cousins, brothers. We are men the same as the Mexicans are. We can do to them what they have done to us. Let us go forward and trail them. I will lead you to their city. We will attack them in their homes. I will fight in the front of the battle. I only ask you to follow me to avenge this wrong done by these Mexicans. Will you come? It is well. You will all come. Remember the rule in war. Men may return or they may be killed. If any of these young men are killed, I want no blame from their kinsmen, for they themselves have chosen to go. If I am killed, no one need mourn for me. My people have all been killed in that country, and I too will die if need be." I returned to my own settlement, reported this success to my chieftain, and immediately departed to the southward into the land of the Nedni Apaches. Their chief, Ho, heard me without comment, but he immediately issued orders for a council, and when all were ready gave a sign that I might speak. I addressed them as I had addressed the Chokonen tribe, and they also promised to help us. It was in the summer of 1859, almost a year from the date of the massacre of Kaskiyeh, that these three tribes were assembled on the Mexican border to go upon the warpath. Their faces were painted, the war bands fastened upon their brows, their long scalp locks ready for the hand and knife of the warrior who would overcome them. Their families had been hidden away in a mountain rendezvous near the Mexican border. With these families a guard was posted, and a number of places of rendezvous designated in case the camp should be disturbed. When all were ready, the chieftains gave command to go forward. None of us were mounted, and each warrior wore moccasins and also a cloth wrapped about his loins. This cloth could be spread over him when he slept, and when on the march would be ample protection as clothing. In battle, if the fight was hard, we did not wish much clothing. Each warrior carried 3 days' rations, but as we often killed game while on the march, we seldom were without food. We traveled in 3 divisions: the Bedonkohe Apaches, led by Mangus Colorado, the Chokonen Apaches by Cochise, and the Nedni Apaches by Ho. However, there was no regular order inside the separate tribes. We usually marched about 14 hours per day, making 3 stops for meals, and traveling 40 to 45 miles a day. I acted as guide into Mexico, and we followed the river courses and mountain ranges because we could better thereby keep our movements concealed. We entered Sonora and went southward past Quitaco, Nacozari, and many smaller settlements. When we were almost at Arispe, we camped, and 8 men rode out from the city to parley with us. These we captured, killed, and scalped. This was to draw the troops from the city, and the next day they came. The skirmishing lasted all day without a general engagement, but just at night we captured their supply train, so we had plenty of provisions and some more guns. That night we posted sentinels and did not move our camp, but rested quietly all night, for we expected heavy work the next day. Early the next morning the warriors were assembled to pray, not for help, but that they might have health and avoid ambush or deceptions by the enemy. As we had anticipated, about 10 o'clock in the morning the whole Mexican force came out. There were 2 companies of cavalry and 2 of infantry. I recognized the cavalry as the soldiers who had killed my people at Kaskiyeh. This I told to the chieftains, and they said that I might direct the battle. I was no chief and never had been, but because I had been more deeply wronged than others, this honor was conferred upon me, and I resolved to prove worthy of the trust. I arranged the Indians in a hollow circle near the river, and the Mexicans drew their infantry up in 2 lines, with the cavalry in reserve. We were in the timber, and they advanced until within about 400 yards, when they halted and opened fire. Soon I led a charge against them, at the same time sending some braves to attack their rear. In all the battle I thought of my murdered mother, wife, and babies, of my father's grave, and of my vow of vengeance, and I fought with fury. Many fell by my hand, and constantly I led the advance. Many braves were killed. The battle lasted about 2 hours. At the last, 4 Indians were alone in the center of the field, myself and 3 other warriors. Our arrows were all gone, our spears broken off in the bodies of dead enemies. We had only our hands and knives with which to fight, but all who had stood against us were dead. Then 2 armed soldiers came upon us from another part of the field. They shot down 2 of our men, and we, the remaining 2, fled toward our own warriors. My companion was struck down by a saber, but I reached our warriors, seized a spear, and turned. The one who pursued me missed his aim and fell by my spear. With his saber I met the trooper who had killed my companion, and we grappled and fell. I killed him with my knife and quickly rose over his body, brandishing his saber, seeking for other troopers to kill. There were none. But the Apaches had seen. Over the bloody field covered with the bodies of Mexicans rang the fierce Apache war whoop. Still covered with the blood of my enemies, still holding my conquering weapon, still hot with the joy of battle, victory, and vengeance, I was surrounded by the Apache braves and made war chief of all the Apaches. Then I gave orders for scalping the slain. I could not call back my loved ones. I could not bring back the dead Apaches. But I could rejoice in this revenge. The Apaches had avenged the massacre of Kaskiyeh. End of Part 2 of the Apaches. Part 1 of the Mexicans. Chapter 7, Fighting Under Difficulties. All the other Apaches were satisfied after the battle of Kaskiyeh, but I still desired more revenge. For several months we were busy with the chase and other peaceful pursuits. Finally I succeeded in persuading 2 other warriors, Acochne and Codeni, to go with me to invade the Mexican country. We left our families with the tribe and went on the warpath. We were on foot and carried 3 days' rations. We entered Mexico on the north line of Sonora and followed the Sierra de Atunes mountains to the south end of the range. Here we decided to attack a small village. I do not know the name of this village. At daylight we approached from the mountains. 5 horses were hitched outside. We advanced cautiously, but just before we reached the horses, the Mexicans opened fire from the houses. My 2 companions were killed. Mexicans swarmed on every side. Some were mounted, some were on foot, and all seemed to be armed. 3 times that day I was surrounded, but I kept fighting, dodging, and hiding. Several times during the day, while in concealment, I had a chance to take deliberate aim at some Mexican who, gun in hand, was looking for me. I do not think I missed my aim either time. With the gathering darkness I found more time to retreat toward Arizona. But the Mexicans did not quit the chase. Several times the next day mounted Mexicans tried to head me off. Many times they fired on me. But I had no more arrows, so I depended upon running and hiding, although I was very tired. I had not eaten since the chase began, nor had I dared to stop for rest. The second night I got clear of my pursuers, but I never slackened my pace until I reached our home in Arizona. I came into our camp without booty, without my companions, exhausted, but not discouraged. The wives and children of my 2 dead companions were cared for by their people. Some of the Apaches blamed me for the evil result of the expedition, but I said nothing. Having failed, it was only proper that I should remain silent. but my feelings towards the Mexicans did not change. I still hated them and longed for revenge. I never ceased to plan for their punishment, but it was hard to get the other warriors to listen to my proposed raids. In a few months after this last adventure, I persuaded 2 other warriors to join me in raiding the Mexican frontier. On our former raid we had gone through the Nedni Apaches range into Sonora. This time we went through the country of the Chokonen and entered the Sierra Madre Mountains. We traveled south, secured more rations, and prepared to begin our raids. We had selected a village near the mountains which we intended to attack at daylight. While asleep that night, Mexican scouts discovered our camp and fired on us, killing 1 warrior. In the morning we observed a company of Mexican troops coming from the south. They were mounted and carried supplies for a long journey. We followed their trail until we were sure that they were headed for our range in Arizona. Then we hurried past them and in 3 days reached our own settlement. We arrived at noon, and that afternoon, about 3 o'clock, these Mexican troops attacked our settlement. Their first volley killed 3 small boys. Many of the warriors of our tribe were away from home, but the few of us who were in camp were able to drive the troops out of the mountains before night. We killed 8 Mexicans and lost 5, 2 warriors and 3 boys. The Mexicans rode due south in full retreat. 4 warriors were detailed to follow them, and in 3 days these trailers returned, saying that the Mexican cavalry had left Arizona going southward. We were quite sure they would not return soon. Soon after this, in the summer of 1860, I was again able to take the warpath against the Mexicans, this time with 25 warriors. We followed the trail of the Mexican troops last mentioned, and entered the Sierra de Sahuaripa Mountains. The second day in these mountains, our scouts discovered mounted Mexican troops. There was only 1 company of cavalry in this command, and I thought that by properly surprising them, we could defeat them. We ambushed the trail over which they were to come. This was at a place where the whole company must pass through a mountain defile. We reserved fire until all of the troops had passed through. Then the signal was given. The Mexican troopers, seemingly without a word of command, dismounted, and placing their horses on the outside of the company for breastworks, made a good fight against us. I saw that we could not dislodge them without using all our ammunition, so I led a charge. The warriors suddenly pressed in from all sides, and we fought hand to hand. During this encounter I raised my spear to kill a Mexican soldier just as he leveled his gun at me. I was advancing rapidly, and my foot slipping in a pool of blood, I fell under the Mexican trooper. He struck me over the head with the butt of his gun, knocking me senseless. Just at that instant a warrior who followed in my footsteps killed the Mexican with a spear. In a few minutes not a Mexican soldier was left alive. When the Apache war cry had died away, and their enemies had been scalped, they began to care for their dead and wounded. I was found lying unconscious where I had fallen. They bathed my head in cold water and restored me to consciousness. Then they bound up my wound, and the next morning, although weak from loss of blood and suffering from a severe headache, I was able to march on the return to Arizona. I did not fully recover for months, and I still wear the scar given me by that musketeer. In this fight we had lost so heavily that there really was no glory in our victory, and we returned to Arizona. No one seemed to want to go on the warpath again that year. In the summer, 1861, with 12 warriors I again went into Mexico. We entered Chihuahua and followed south on the east side of the Sierra Madre Mountains 4 days' journey, then crossed over to the Sierra de Sahuaripa range, not far east of Casa Grande. Here we rested 1 day and sent out scouts to reconnoiter. They reported pack trains camped 5 miles west of us. The next morning, just at daybreak, As these drivers were starting with their mule pack train, we attacked them. They rode away for their lives, leaving us the booty. The mules were loaded with provisions, most of which we took home. 2 mules were loaded with side meat or bacon. This we threw away. We started to take these pack trains home, going northward through Sonora. But when near Casita, Mexican troops overtook us. It was at daybreak, and we were just finishing our breakfast. We had no idea that we had been pursued or that our enemies were near until they opened fire. At the first volley, a bullet struck me a glancing lick, just at the lower corner of the left eye, and I fell unconscious. All the other Indians fled to cover. The Mexicans, thinking me dead, started in pursuit of the fleeing Indians. In a few moments I regained consciousness and had started at full speed for the woods, when another company coming up opened fire on me. Then the soldiers who had been chasing the other Indians turned, and I stood between 2 hostile companies. But I did not stand long. Bullets whistled in every direction and at close range to me. One inflicted a slight flesh wound on my side, but I kept running, dodging, and fighting until I got clear of my pursuers. I climbed up a steep canyon where the cavalry could not follow. The troopers saw me, but did not dismount and try to follow. I think they were wise not to come on. It had been understood that in case of surprise with this booty, our place of rendezvous should be the Santa Bita Mountains in Arizona. We did not reassemble in Mexico, but traveled separately, and in 3 days we were encamped in our place of rendezvous. From this place we returned home empty-handed. We had not even a partial victory to report. I again returned wounded, but I was not yet discouraged. Again I was blamed by our people, and again I had no reply. After our return, many of the warriors had gone on a hunt, and some of them had gone north to trade for blankets from the Navajo Indians. I remained at home, trying to get my wounds healed. One morning, just at daybreak, when the squaws were lighting the campfires to prepare breakfast, 3 companies of Mexican troops who had surrounded our settlement in the night opened fire. There was no time for fighting. Men, women, and children fled for their lives. Many women and children and a few warriors were killed, and 4 women were captured. My left eye was still swollen shut, but with the other I saw well enough to hit one of the officers with an arrow, and then make good my escape among the rocks. The troopers burned our teepees and took our arms, provisions, ponies, and blankets. Winter was at hand. There were not more than 20 warriors in camp at this time, and only a few of us had secured weapons during the excitement of the attack. A few warriors followed the trail of the troops as they went back to Mexico with their booty, but were unable to offer battle. It was a long, long time before we were able to go on the warpath against the Mexicans. The 4 women who were captured at this time by the Mexicans were taken into Sonora, Mexico, where they were compelled to work for the Mexicans. After some years, they escaped to the mountains and started to find our tribe. They had knives which they had stolen from the Mexicans, but they had no other weapons. They had no blankets, so at night they would make a little teepee by cutting brush with their knives and setting them up for the walls. The top was covered over with brush. In this temporary teepee they would all sleep. One night, when their campfire was low, they heard growling just outside the teepee. Francisco, the youngest woman of the party, about 17 years of age, started to build up the fire, when a mountain lion crashed through the teepee and attacked her. The suddenness of the attack made her drop her knife, but she fought as best she could with her hand. She was no match for the lion, however. Her left shoulder was crushed and partly torn away. The lion kept trying to catch her by the throat. This she prevented with her hands for a long time. He dragged her for about 300 yards. Then she found her strength was failing her from loss of blood, and she called to the other women for help. The lion had been dragging her by one foot, and she had been catching hold of his legs and of the rocks and underbrush to delay him. Finally he stopped and stood over her. She again called her companions, and they attacked him with their knives and killed him. Then they dressed her wounds and nursed her in the mountains for about a month. When she was able to walk, they resumed their journey and reached our tribe in safety. This woman, Francisco, was held as a prisoner of war with the other Apaches and died on the Fort Sill Reservation in 1892. Her face was always disfigured with those scars, and she never regained perfect use of her hands. The 3 older women died before we became prisoners of war. Many women and children were carried away at different times by Mexicans. Not many of them ever returned, and those who did underwent many hardships in order to be again united with their people. Those who did not escape were slaves to the Mexicans, or perhaps even more degraded. When warriors were captured by the Mexicans, they were kept in chains. 4 warriors who were captured once at a place north of Casa Grande, called by the Indians Onas, were kept in chains for a year and a half, when they were exchanged for Mexicans whom we had captured. We never chained prisoners or kept them in confinement, but they seldom got away. Mexican men, when captured, were compelled to cut wood and herd horses. Mexican women and children were treated as our own people. Chapter 8. Raids that were successful. In the summer of 1862, I took 8 men and invaded Mexican territory. We went south on the west side of the Sierra Madre Mountains for 5 days, then in the night crossed over to the southern part of the Sierra de Sahuaripa range. Here we again camped to watch for pack trains. About 10 o'clock next morning, 4 drivers, mounted, came past our camp with a pack mule train. As soon as they saw us, they rode for their lives, leaving us the booty. This was a long train, and packed with blankets, calico, saddles, tinware, and loaf sugar. We hurried home as fast as we could with these provisions, and on our return, while passing through a canyon in the Santa Catalina range of mountains in Arizona, met a white man driving a mule pack train. When we first saw him, he had already seen us, and was riding at full tilt up the canyon. We examined his train and found that his mules were all loaded with cheese. We put them in with the other train and resumed our journey. We did not attempt to trail the driver, and I am sure he did not try to follow us. In 2 days we arrived at home. Then Mangus Colorado, our chief, assembled the tribe. We gave a feast, divided the spoils, and danced all night. Some of the pack mules were killed and eaten. This time after our return we kept out scouts so that we would know if Mexican troops should attempt to follow us. On the 3rd day our scouts came into camp and reported Mexican cavalry dismounted and approaching our settlement. All our warriors were in camp. Mangus Colorado took command of one division and I of the other. We hoped to get possession of their horses, then surround the troops in the mountains and destroy the whole company. This we were unable to do, for they too had scouts. However, within 4 hours after we started, we had killed 10 troopers with the loss of only 1 man, and the Mexican cavalry was in full retreat, followed by 30 armed Apaches, who gave them no rest until they were far inside the Mexican country. No more troops came that winter. For a long time we had plenty of provisions, plenty of blankets, and plenty of clothing. We also had plenty of cheese and sugar. Another summer, 1863, I selected 3 warriors and went on a raid into Mexico. We went south into Sonora, camping in the Sierra de Sahuaripa Mountains. About 40 miles west of Casa Grande is a small village in the mountains, called by the Indians Crasanas. We camped near this place and concluded to make an attack. We had noticed that just at midday no one seemed to be stirring, so we planned to make our attack at the noon hour. The next day we stole into the town at noon. We had no guns, but were armed with spears and bows and arrows. When the war whoop was given to open the attack, the Mexicans fled in every direction. Not one of them made any attempt to fight us. We shot some arrows at the retreating Mexicans, but killed only one. Soon all was silent in the town, and no Mexicans could be seen. When we discovered that all the Mexicans were gone, we looked through their houses and saw many curious things. These Mexicans kept many more kinds of property than the Apaches did. Many of the things we saw in the houses we could not understand, but in the stores we saw much that we wanted, so we drove in a herd of horses and mules and packed as much provisions and supplies as we could on them. Then we formed these animals into a pack train and returned safely to Arizona. The Mexicans did not even trail us. When we arrived in camp, we called the tribe together and feasted all day. We gave presents to everyone. That night the dance began, and it did not cease until noon the next day. This was, perhaps, the most successful raid ever made by us into Mexican territory. I do not know the value of the booty, but it was very great, for we had supplies enough to last our whole tribe for a year or more. End of Part 1 of The Mexicans.